Welcome back, everyone, to another live stream on the Global Gambit podcast. We're going to be joined momentarily by Alan Eyre, who is the Distinguished Diplomatic Fellow, I think is the correct title, at the Middle East Institute. I will introduce him properly when he joins us, but he had a slight technical error joining, so he'll be here in just a second. But I thought I'd use this opportunity to sort of reflect on the past 24-hour developments. I want to focus a little bit more on the UAE angle this time around. Alan's been critical in dealing with US-Iranian relations, nuclear. He was actually one of the few people to be fluent, one of the few Persian sort of speaking US officials. And he basically served as spokesman for US policy. But, looking at what we've seen in the past 24, 36 hours, it's been, to me, personally, an illustration of miscommunication and an attempt to clarify positions, narrative, to influence and control the narrative framing. As you know, if you're a regular on the channel or have been subscribed for a while, you'll know that I emphasize the importance of optics. And often in international relations, it's as much what the international community perceives of you as it is your physical or actual perspective. So what I mean by that is, like, if you want to be recognized as a nation, well, one of the biggest factors is getting other countries to recognize you. And so in the case of a conflict like the US and Iran, how countries are perceiving you and the situation is almost as important as the nature of the conflict itself, which is why so much emphasis is often put on propaganda and information warfare and so on. I'm sure regulars of will think that's kind of obvious, but I think yesterday was a case in point where the Iranians wanted to quickly clarify that they didn't actually intend to strike American vessels. They just wanted to make warning shots. Because I think it's for them. If they do that, if they do actually strike the US, then that gives them free rein to be hit back, and then the whole cycle of escalation of war and exchange off we go again. Both sides really, I think, want peace, albeit they don't know how to go about getting that, and that's what we covered with Ross earlier. But we're joined now by Alan.
Hey, how are you doing?
Good. We are already live. I thought I would get started by warming up the audience by giving some of my raw reactions to the past 24 hours, given the intensity. And what I did want to do a little bit for this conversation, Alan, is get your takes on what we've seen yesterday. We spoke to Ross, your colleague, just earlier, and he was talking a lot about threshold testing and other elements. But I'd also quite like to dive a little bit into the UAE angle, because it's they right at the time of speaking with you now, it seems to be the Iranians have been targeting the Emiratis again. So I'm kind of perplexed as to why, and I'd like to break that down with you. But let me just introduce you formally, because I think that that's the right thing to do. You are the Distinguished Diplomatic Fellow at the Middle East Institute, and you're an expert on US-Iranian relations. You were critical in discussion over the JCPOA mediation, and that's something else I'd like to touch on later on. But I guess after everything we saw yesterday, what were your main takeaways? Where do you think we are now?
Well, I think that the Operation Freedom was almost irrelevant. The U.S., I think President Trump wanted to do something, anything, because he realizes that the blockade of Iranian ports is moving at too slow a time scale to make any real difference. So he figured he'd do this Operation Freedom, but it's clear to anyone who knows anything about maritime shipping, you can't reopen the strait militarily, So again, ships going through the Strait of Hormuz are single digits, and most maritime traffic will not resume until they have a good feeling about it being safe. We're nowhere near that. But the most interesting thing, as you alluded to, was Iran expanding, announcing it was expanding its zone of control to in the Persian Gulf to include Fujairah. We all know that Fujairah had, in a sense, escaped the blockade of the Strait by Iran with ADCOP, the Abu Dhabi crude oil pipeline. But again, now with the new definition, it falls within that. And yesterday's attacks on the UAE and today's attacks show that Iran, when it wants to escalate, is doing so by attacking the UAE, who it sees as a partner with Israel and the United States in these hostilities, much more so than any of the other Gulf countries.
So is that the primary reason then that the Iranians are targeting the Emiratis? It's because Ross mentioned some figures during our chat that sort of during the heightened period of March, Qatar had been targeted around 700 times versus the UAE, which was about 3,000. So why not Qatar as well? Because you've got the huge airbase, you've got the huge US base there, and it was the epicenter of some of the strikes back in June of last year. So why the UAE more than Qatar?
Because the UAE is a much more obvious choice. It's a member of the Abraham Accords. It's allied with Israel in a way that Qatar is not. Again, Iran has to attack somebody by its calculation because it has to escalate, and it has to prevent the facade of normality descending in on this war. It needs to keep oil prices high. It needs to keep a somewhat crisis mentality. So it has to attack. It has to escalate in response to this Operation Freedom. And the UAE is the top of the line. You know, it also wants to exacerbate the split between the UAE and the kingdom, which is happening on its own accord. So, it's just the obvious choice. You know, attacking Israel doesn't really do much because Israel is not linked to the world economy to the extent that the UAE is. It's not in the Persian Gulf. So, yeah, I mean, it's the obvious choice for this very same reason that the UAE got the preponderance of Iranian kinetic strikes during the war. You know, it's first in line to get attacked when Iran wants to make a point.
So when, therefore, the Iranians feel the compulsion to escalate, that's out of a sense of necessity, not out of choice then. I mean, do they really need to escalate? Is an escalation ladder ensuring that one side has to constantly do something to demonstrate what, deterrence, or that they still have the capacity to fight against the US or something like that?
Yeah, don't forget, Iran thinks that this war, and to an extent the previous war, the people running Iran, hardline, militant, IRGC, think that because in the past they responded perfunctorily to, for example, the killing of Qasem Soleimani, and they didn't respond not just more than proportionally, that encouraged U.S. and Israeli aggression. That's what Iran thinks. They thought, well, you know, tit for tat, they do this, we'll do a performative response. And they think that emboldened the United States and Israel. So this time you had the blockade, and now you've got the, whatever it's called, Operation Freedom. Yeah, Iran feels it has to do something because it can't let the U.S. just keep ratcheting up and achieving escalation dominance. Don't forget, that's what this dance is all about. You know, neither side wants to negotiate, preferring instead to sort of try to eke out that marginal iota of escalation dominance that puts the other side in a weaker position. Neither side can get that. Both sides are still trying to get it. So that's why we see Iran. I mean, and also, as I've said before, don't forget that this administration, its muscles for negotiations have atrophied to the point where they're almost unusable. You know, the U.S. administration has a $1 trillion military budget, and that's the hammer it's using to beat this particular nail. You know, I don't even think they just real negotiation, which is at this point the only possible way to avoid further escalations, especially given the fragility of this ceasefire, is the only way to do it. But they don't want to do that, or they've forgotten how.
So right now, Trump is giving some comments, shall we say. He's called the Iranian Navy being reduced effectively to little boats with machine guns. I don't know how accurate that is, but we would have had an Iran with a nuclear weapon had the US not engaged. Do you agree with that? Some people think, yes, they were near nuclear capable, but
total nonsense. Okay. That is, I don't know if he's lying or if he's delusional, but that is not the case. Okay. The US intelligence community said that Iran stopped sort of sticking their toes in the shallow water of weaponization around 2003 and hadn't resumed since then. So this whole pretext of the war that Iran was close to a nuclear weapon and we had to act now, otherwise there would have been nuclear conflagration across the Middle East, is just puerile, period.
All right. Well, I think this is why I was very keen to get you back on so soon, Alan. You have a certain way with words that is very refreshing to hear, certainly as a diplomatic expert as well. But one thing I did read in Al Arabiya yesterday, taking it with a degree of obviously skepticism given the amount of information that's coming out conflicting one another, is simply that there was a suggestion that the Iranian camp were opening up to the idea of softening their demands over nuclear, enrichment. Do you think that would be the case? How much do the Iranians want a deal of some form to you versus the Americans?
They definitely want a deal. I mean, geez, it's goodness gracious. Before the war, their economy was in horrible shape. As a result of this war, it's whenever the bombs stop, it's going to be so much worse. So they definitely want a deal. But the people running Iran right now, the IRGC, the single most powerful institution in Iran, have hardwired into their strategic mind the concept that if you compromise beyond your red lines under extreme pressure, that invites further aggression. So they are not going to give up indigenous enrichment. They are not going to send all of their HEU to the United States. Now, they will accept more than they were willing to accept under Obama. So President Trump could say he'll get a better deal if he wants. They're willing to suspend their enrichment, something that didn't happen with the JCPOA for a number of years, not the amount of time President Trump wants, but a significant amount of time. But at the end, any nuclear deal is this: constraints on Iran's nuclear program, nuclear energy program. And the key part of that is increased verification by the IAEA, because whatever status Iran's nuclear program is, the key point is if the IAEA has eyes and ears on what's going on, we'll have sufficient lead time if Iran decides to weaponize. So yeah, it's important how many centrifuges Iran has. Yes, it's important how much enriched uranium they're allowed to keep. But what's most important is the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency, which is the policeman for the NPT, Non-Proliferation Treaty, that they have serious access to what's going on in Iran. So restrictions on Iran's nuclear program in exchange for a lessening of sanctions on Iran and an unblocking of the Iranian assets that are frozen right now. That's the exoskeleton of the deal that Trump can have.
Yeah, but on this point, okay, so there's a lot of debate, speculation around how much unity there is within Iran, right? Of the two camps, I personally think that the Trump administration has greater conflictions because Trump is just undermining his own State Department. He's undermining his own collective front versus the Iranians. Yes, they have differing degrees by which they want to threshold test, but ultimately they're more united.
What do you mean?
Well, that's what. That's a term that, for example, Ross was mentioning earlier about threshold testing to see how far they can test the other side to see escalation.
Escalation dominance, right?
Yeah. So the point I'm making is that there are divisions within each camp. Trump's is worse, I think, because it's got Trump, but the Iranians aren't a monolithic entity either, are they? The IRGC has differing degrees by which they want to engage the Americans, and others think that this is the golden opportunity to continue to undermine America and emphasize just how big a mistake they've made strategically. Do you disagree with that?
I disagree with that, respectfully. I think the United States has no internal disagreement. President Trump is the decider, to quote the Bush phrase. The Congress is inert. They won't even enforce the War Powers Resolution. So Congress isn't going to do anything. I mean, to an extent, President Trump is under pressure from public opinion. His unfavorability ratings are historically low. So yeah, he's under pressure, but there are no different factions within the U.S. government, though it is interesting that people like J.D. Vance are furiously leaking about how they were against this war. Elements within the military leaking about how they counseled President Bush. So everybody is already accepting the fact that this war, everyone behind the scenes, is accepting the fact that this war was a massive strategic blunder, and they're all trying to get on the right side of history. Even President Trump realizes in retrospect this was a serious mistake done largely at the behest of Israel. In terms of Iran, President Trump is overplaying and, again, exaggerating the amount of internal Iranian difference of opinion because he wants to say, well, we want a deal, but Iran can't get its act together. That's nonsense. Iran can get its act together. Its act pretty much is together. Yes, Iran has domestic internal politics. Yes, different people have different opinions. But at the end of the day, it's on a war footing, fighting for its life. The most powerful institution by far is the IRGC. Sure, I have no doubt that there are internal differences of opinion within the IRGC. And yes, the most significant difference in Iran right now, as opposed to before this war, is that the supreme leader, the whole system was configured to his personality over 39 years, is dead. And so previously, when there were internal disputes within different factions, the supreme leader settled it like that. He's dead, and his son doesn't have that power and is also concerned for security reasons. So communication with him is much harder. So there is more internal decision-making friction in Iran than there was previously before the war, but that's not why things are moving slowly. They're moving slowly because neither side has reached that pain point yet where their primary motivation is, we have to end this war. We have to find a negotiated solution. As I said earlier, both sides now are still trying to, wrestlers looking for a hold, trying to find that way of just increasing pressure on the other side so the other side cries uncle and capitulates. Not going to happen.
What constitutes the end of the ceasefire? Who has the leverage right now?
Ceasefire already ended. But again, neither side is saying it's ending. So, but I mean, the ceasefires without a concurrent political process that has some type of vitality tend to disintegrate and dissipate, right? Even if you ignore the role of Israel, who doubtless is actually trying to scuttle this ceasefire because it wants a resumption of hostilities with Iran because it hasn't achieved its goal of collapsing the Iranian state. Put Israel aside, the U.S. and Iran have a ceasefire, but at the same time, as I said, each side is trying to achieve escalation dominance, and so it's a tenuous thing, this ceasefire. If you're not moving forward, you're moving backwards. What is it Catherine the Great said? What doesn't grow rots. This ceasefire is in the process of rotting.
Well, it may be rotting, but it doesn't mean that it's not still in force. All I've heard in the past 24 hours is a continuous emphasis, especially by the United States, that this ceasefire is still intact and that these attacks do not, quote, meet the threshold, and that comes from Joint Chiefs Chairman Dan Kane. So
yeah, exactly, I agree.
So the ceasefire is holding then.
Okay, it's holding, but what is it? It's holding less than it was before President Trump did Operation Freedom. I'm not saying the ceasefire is we need to read last rites over it. All I'm saying is that this type of ceasefire is intrinsically fragile because there's no concurrent, vibrant, vital political process going on in conjunction with it. You are right. The U.S. has not yet resumed bombing Iranian infrastructure, right? So to that extent, the ceasefire is holding. Iran has not yet resumed bombing Israel. So yes, the ceasefire is holding. How much longer it can hold, with both sides trying to increase their leverage on the other, that's the salient question.
It certainly is, but isn't this just a reflection of the type of world we live in, where no state really declares war anymore? It's not really officially since 1944 have we seen official declarations of war. So is this just a case of what someone commented once, a hot peace, that we're just sort of in a perpetual state of instability, but it's sort of peaceful and the world economy just adjusts and absorbs the ramifications and we all just get on with our lives whilst this situation lingers in the background? Sort of like the war in Ukraine, right? It's continually ongoing, but nothing really changes.
Well, you can't do that now because every day the strait is closed. The economic pain compounds. But you're right. We're in a post-globalization era where the world is becoming less stable, more atomized, more Hobbesian, if you will. We see the UAE breaking away from KSA. So yeah, the sort of the Soviet Union collapses, you get this, 1990s globalization. We're all interdependent. We're all working together. And then that starts breaking up for a variety of reasons. States become atomized. People start using economic choke points, for political reasons. This is another manifestation of that, and the Middle East at the best of days was not a stable, cohesive economic entity. And because of this war, which was, again, initiated largely due to the stratagems of Israel, it's becoming less stable. And that's having global economic implications.
Yeah, I want to dive deeper into the economics in the coming days for sure. But just another point about this then. So, I just want to get your takes on a couple of things Trump said. Again, the press conference finished a short while ago. So he said that the US is making, quote, tremendous deals on reopening the Strait of Hormuz. And he also said that Iran knows what not to do. So what does that mean? So they're just not to actually fully escalate. He doesn't really care if they're striking UAE. What would be the point where the Americans think that they have to re-engage? If the Iranians just start targeting American assets directly, or purely American assets, or they will come to the aid of their allies and partners?
Yeah, President Trump has two modes when he's talked to the press about Iran. He's either trying to calm the markets, as he did before the markets opened on Monday when he announced Operation Freedom, or he's trying to scare the bejesus out of Iran, when he says things like, we will destroy your civilization forever. Okay? So President Trump does not want to resume military hostilities. He realizes that that is going to make the global economic situation worse. And again, he's looking at all of this through the context of domestic U.S. politics. He rolled the dice at the behest of Israel, thought he could do some decapitation, a little shock and awe, and he could, have another Venezuela. That didn't happen. And now he's sinking deeper and deeper in this quagmire with no way out. And again, military escalation isn't going to get him where he needs to go. And I think he realizes that. So even though Iran buffets the UAE with missiles and rockets or fires at U.S. destroyers, as far as he's concerned, why not still call it a ceasefire? As you point out, the ceasefire still more or less is holding. So he's, I don't, there's probably a better word than flailing, but he's casting around for different options to extricate himself from this without a massive domestic political failure. And he can't find that way yet. Because also, the only way that he could do that involves negotiating with the Iranians and giving them things that would be toxic politically for him with the midterms coming up.
But it goes back to what you were saying earlier, though, that it doesn't matter about Congress and other things. Okay, granted, obviously, they're largely incapacitated in this sort of regard. But isn't Trump undermining his... there isn't a unified front, I don't think. Like Rubio, I haven't seen him in the public eye for a while. He's not ever really been on side about this. I think it's pretty clear that Vance, before being pulled into the diplomatic negotiating activities, was not exactly on board with it. So how can we say that, okay, Trump decides and he does what he wants, whatever. I get it, he's commander in chief, but does he not have any restraint? No one around him, his wife, maybe keeping him in check. Like, what can influence him to make a more reasonably grounded decision, not simply pure impulsivity and reactions to what the Iranians do, which piss him off?
Yeah, he can't. Again, he's in his late 70s. Again, this administration is qualitatively different than all previous administrations. And this is not a partisan issue of Democrats are better than Republicans or Republicans are better than Democrats. I've worked for every president in one form or another since Reagan. Okay. This administration is staffed by people, by and large, at the highest levels, without the requisite expertise and integrity to give President Trump needed advice. He has a cabinet of sycophants. Watch any cabinet meeting, and that will become obvious within 30 seconds. So there is no one who is going to tell President Trump, all due respect, sir, you're wrong. I think we should do this. Okay? So sure, there's still expertise in the U.S. government on Iran and on foreign policy. He's just not going to listen to it. He's going to say, I know more than anyone else about whatever the topic is, and this is what I want to do. And that might change depending on whatever, which is why you see so many mutually inconsistent statements by the president. So could President Trump change? It's like my kids when they were little used to ask me questions like, if you could go back and be Winston Churchill or something, what would you do? Well, you can't, because I can't be Winston Churchill. President Trump cannot be anybody other than President Trump. Some people go, well, if you would give President Trump advice on this, what would you tell him? I wouldn't tell him anything, because he's not going to listen. Okay? He's going to do what he always does, what got him here. This is his tragic flaw. It happened in the first administration to an extent with COVID, which by and large, gutted his first administration. And it's happening now. This war, illegal, immoral, and totally unnecessary, is going to sink his second term. Nothing he can do, because he's not going to do that which is necessary, which is change his red lines and try to seek a modus vivendi with Iran.
So don't get me wrong, I'm certainly not attempting to sane wash what's happening or what Trump represents. But at one point, will he... Okay, I'll rephrase it this way. A lot of people have suggested that, if he gets a sort of nuclear deal, it would just be a watered down, a repackaging of the JCPOA. There was an article, I think, in Foreign Policy or somewhere, one of the foreign-orientated magazine outlets, that talked about the Obama era of engagement with the IRGC, with the Islamic Republic, weighing heavily over Trump. Do you agree with that he would just get a rehashed version of the JCPOA, if not kind of worse?
First of all, let me make this caveat. I could be wrong in all this. It could be the case that President Trump somehow gets Iran to forswear indigenous enrichment forever, gets Iran to export its highly enriched uranium, I don't think that's probable. I think that's quite unlikely. Will any deal he get be essentially similar to the JCPOA? Yes. Now, he might get a front end of Iran agrees to suspend for a certain amount of time, which he can say that's why it's better than the JCPOA. But it seems to me Iran will never give up what it sees as its right to enrich on Iranian soil. And let me state, there's no such right in the NPT. The NPT does not say every country has a right to enrich. It says that every country, if it lives up to the responsibilities within the NPT, have a right for the peaceful use of nuclear energy. So I'm not justifying Iran's stance at all. I'm just saying this is how they think. So they're not going to give up indigenous enrichment, not because they need it. Nuclear power only gets 1% of Iran's energy, and that reactor in Bushehr, Russia gives the fuel. So Iran doesn't need its nuclear energy program, right? At all. But it's a source of pride, and it's become a red line. And all red lines at a certain point become, sort of important for preserving for their own sake, regardless of the original logic that caused you to put it as a red line. Now there's a new red line, unfortunately, as a result of this war, which is, and we saw this in the recent speech or statement by the new supreme leader, Mojtaba Khamenei, where Iranian control of the Strait of Hormuz is now becoming an Iranian red line, similar to indigenous enrichment. And that's a very bad thing. So President Trump, by trying to deal with the nuclear issue, and again, don't forget, it took us months to get the rationale for this war out of this administration. The one they seemed to settle on was we had to attack Iran now because they were building up their missile capability. And if we waited much longer, they'd have so many missiles, they could use that as a fence behind which they could build nuclear weapons. I don't think that's true, but at least they finally settled on a reason to justify this war in their mind. But yeah, he's going to get a deal that is essentially the same. If he's lucky, he will get a deal that's essentially the same as the JCPOA, though it could well be the case that he doesn't get a nuclear deal and just declares victory, pulls out, leaves a Strait of Hormuz under Iranian control with some de facto tolling that the rest of the world has to work on getting lifted. That was a long answer. Sorry about that.
Well, no, it just gives me time to digest and think. And the reason I sort of facepalm there is just because of the way you framed it, Alan. It's they finally settled on a reason of why they instigated one of the most consequential wars in modern history, with ramifications from the Western Hemisphere all the way to China. I love that. Just sort of like, should we pick regime change? Nah, let's stick it on a spin the wheel and just sort of figure it out. Do you want to put it on a dartboard? Let's see where we get there. Oh my God. I mean,
they did. It was like area fire. They just kept shooting reasons, and hoping to take out the whole grid square. And finally, they're like, oh, well, this one seems sort of plausible. No one's laughing out loud. So that's the line they settled on.
But how do we get out of this seeming entrapment? I would just call it escalation entrapment, right? How do we get out of this? I used this term to another guest on the weekend, but like circle jerk, right? Yeah. We're just going round and round, merry-go-round of like, well, the Hormuz Strait is shut. No, it isn't. Yes, it is. Well, we're having talks. No, we're not. Do you like this proposal? Not really. Well, here's one of us. I don't like that either. Like, how many times can we go round with this before we finally see an actual end to the Iran war of 2026?
Well, I think I've said before, I don't know if it was talking to you, it is a peculiarly American misconception to think that every problem has a solution. So we're not getting back to the way the world was February 27th, 2026. It was a complex system, right? And we shook it up. And now it's broken, and all the various components have to find a new homeostasis. That new homeostasis will be less stable and more expensive than the old one. Okay? So now we're talking, what's the least bad option that we can envision? And the least bad option we can envision is a Strait of Hormuz realistic option that perhaps has tolling on it for a while. And again, that affects the Gulf countries. Like something like 85% of the cost of the Iranian tolling scheme would be paid by the Gulf countries. And that's bad. And, no one wants this to be a new norm. But guess what? We might not be able to right away get, untold navigational flow back and forth in the strait. And that's not exigent. If the Iranian toll as constituted adds about 40 cents to the price of a barrel of oil, for the global economy, that's fine. And again, we declare victory, get a nuclear deal with Iran and leave it to China, right, to use its influence with Iran to get the tolling lifted, or the GCC countries, because Iran will have to at least try to find a way to live with the GCC countries after this war is over. It's going to be very hard, maybe not doable, but they're going to have to try. And so what's the way out of this? It's like the physician's creed: first, do no harm. And the problem with this U.S. administration is they just keep making it worse, So President Trump needs to stop doing social media, and they need to increase the communication with Iran. When we were doing the JCPOA, we didn't negotiate via social media or dueling press conferences, right? We had a couple of sort of generic, bland, boring statements we would always use with the press when they asked questions. And, the real action was done behind closed doors, face to face. Now, I'm not saying that that's likely because there's so little trust between Iran and the U.S., but the slim window of solving this without a global recession caused by the ongoing closure of the Strait of Hormuz is only through negotiations.
Yeah, but you're attempting to apply rationale and a sense of moderacy to someone who operates in any way bad. Shouldn't we both agree and accept, Alan, that the determining factor here will be exogenous? It will be the economy being the global economy, let alone the US one, being absolutely untenable. It will be the midterms forcing Trump's hand. It will be something other than Trump's own desire. American stockpile ammunition. Someone's written a good comment here. There'll be some other element that forces the White House to make a shift, or the economy of Iran. I mean, we shouldn't forget the oil shortages within the country. The economy is in, a non-functional state, put it that way. So do you not think that there's going to be something exogenous that is the determining factor?
No, I agree with you 100%. And but what's clear to me, and again, I could be wrong, is that pain threshold will be reached far more quickly in the U.S. than it is Iran. U.S. has midterms. Iran doesn't. Iran is quite capable and willing, as we've seen, of killing thousands of its citizens in the streets if they cause a problem. The people, the IRGC running Iran right now, they're not feeling economic pain, right? They're in a fight for their life. And for them, that's more important than the fact that millions of Iranians are losing their jobs because of this war, or that, food is more expensive, gasoline is less obtainable. So the point is, and it's obvious at this point, that Iran can take far more economic pain than the U.S. can in any sort of time frame that's relevant for solving this war. And so you're right. What will probably change the dynamics at some point, President Trump will wake up and have to use the quote from Iranian history, drink from the chalice of poison, which is what Ayatollah Khomeini said when he was forced to accept the UN Security Council Resolution 598 in 1998 and accept a ceasefire with Iraq. He said, I have to drink from this poison chalice. So I think President Trump will at some point have to drink from a poison chalice and say and he doesn't care about the global economy, but the economic consequences, when gas is $5 a gallon, right? At some point, he's going to say enough and move U.S. red lines. And then we might get this logjam broken in terms of negotiating with Iran.
I'm amazed that you think Trump will ever have such a capacity to do that. I mean, I'd like you to be correct.
You're right. This could be, God forbid, a sort of frozen conflict where the strait continues to be closed. Okay. But again, right now, we're not even close, the world, to feeling the pain because we're still drawing down reserves, right? Oil, jet fuel, that ends pretty quickly. In the next 3 weeks. And again, the U.S. is feeling this least because, we've got our own LNG, we've got our own shale, all that stuff. Asia's feeling it the most. Africa, Europe, it's moving across like a plague. So, yeah, we're feeling it least and we're feeling it last. But still, this dynamic will reach American shores more than it has now.
I do think that the key inflection point, I think, will come with the midterms. I cannot see this conflict, I don't know what even to describe it at this point, this impasse lasting beyond the end of this year. But I can't think of anything else before that really would trigger Trump so much.
No, but the thing is, by the time the midterms happens, it's too late, right? After the midterms, President Trump is a lame duck president, right? People start looking about, who's going to be the next president, who's going to be the candidate. So I think President Trump's calculus is, we have to minimize the damage being done midterms because, if the Democrats get the House, that's articles of impeachment right there, possibly, right? And it already seems to be the case that the Democrats have a very good chance of regaining the House. But geez, it would take a political earthquake for the Republicans to lose the Senate also. And, but if this thing keeps going badly, that's, to use a double negative, not inconceivable.
So over what time frame then do you think we will see a significant change, a shift, be them in a heightened, an intensified, renewed effort diplomatically, or just someone saying, well, we're going to reduce our military activity regardless?
It's funny. President Trump, do you remember during the Iraq War, Thomas Friedman, the editorialist, would always say the next 6 months are crucial. And so people used to joke that 6 months was a Friedman unit. So, the Trump unit is 2 to 3 weeks. It's always 2 to 3 weeks in the future. So I will say probably within one, at most 2 Trump units, we're going to start seeing some real changes. Like in terms, because at this point, it's not a pricing problem. It's a physical problem. There won't be enough jet fuel. Not that you have to pay more for jet fuel, but you can't have it. Okay. I mean, what do they say? Nature bats last. Physical reality, physics bats last. And we're getting to that right now with the continued and compounding consequences of the Strait of Hormuz being closed. So again, just from what I read, this becomes a lot more painful for the global economy and for the U.S., within the next month.
Yeah, I thought that I knew that the aerial campaign, the intensity of March wouldn't last beyond really a month. What I wasn't so sure was just how long this situation could go on. And to be honest, it's lasting longer than I thought it would. I thought we'd be wrapped up good before the beginning of summer, but it seems like we could go into that. But certainly I agree, it has to wind down sooner than the midterms actually themselves. Yeah. I guess final question really for you, Alan, before we hopefully have you back in the near future, is simply what would you encourage people to look out for? If we were to reconvene in a week, 2 weeks, what do you think might be the most realistic outlook?
It's like your blood pressure or your cholesterol level. The only metric worth watching at this point is maritime flow through the Strait of Hormuz. Okay? Until and unless that starts ascending up like this, then it's going to get worse. Okay, now the price of oil, again, there's the futures price, there's the spot price, and you can watch that if you're sort of conversant with that reality. But for the guy or gal sitting on the couch watching the TV and like, well, how should I feel about this war? Is it progress or not? Don't forget, the Strait was open and untold February 27th, right? So forget the nuclear issue. That wasn't a problem. Now, it will be a problem once the war ends, because it's far more likely that Iran will seek a nuclear weapon now than it was before February 27th. But in terms of avoiding a global recession that no one wants, the only metric is maritime passage. Not just ships being escorted out in onesies and twosies, but ships actually going into the strait to get loaded. Because don't forget, even if this problem ends tomorrow, it's going to take months for these ships to go where they need to go to resume the supply chains optimally. VLCC, that carries oil, moves at 10 to 15 knots. That's 20 miles an hour. That's a fast bicycle. So even if things go incredibly well, it's going to take a lot of time. And the people who have closed the Strait of Hormuz isn't the Iranians. It's the maritime insurers who are saying, I'm not giving you hull or cargo insurance at any sort of rates until I've got a warm, fuzzy feeling that ships can travel through the strait. That's going to take time. So that's what I would watch. Everything else is theater.
All of it, all the rest is noise. Well, and as not the most confident cyclist, I mean, 20 miles an hour sounds pretty fast to me, but I'm definitely not Dutch, put it that way. But anyway, Alan, it's been an absolute pleasure. Distinguished diplomatic fellow at the Middle East Institute in Washington, DC. Thank you very much for your time, as always. Everyone watching, do check out Alan's work, do check out the MEI, and of course, like the video, subscribe to the channel. And thanks very much for listening if you're on the podcast, and we'll see you all very soon. Take care.